The Florida legislature's 2026 session is coming, and the lawmakers in this state are already working on a couple of crazy bills, including one that would pave the way to completely ban all abortion in Florida from the moment an egg is fertilized, regardless of the circumstances of the mother, whether or not it's someone who's been the victim of rape or incest. It would set the stage to ban all abortion. They're also moving another bill that would protect one of the biggest industrial corporations in the state, a phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacturing giant that is responsible for some of the ugliest environmental destruction we see anywhere in the state. They've got a bill written by lobbyists for this company that would protect the company from accountability for some of its actions. We're going to unpack both of those bills in just a sec. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. Well, it has begun. We have truly and earnestly begun the ramp up to the Florida legislature's 2026 legislative session. And now, so in Florida, technically, the legislature meets for once a year for 60 days. We have a 60-day annual legislative session here in Florida. Usually, as we saw earlier this year, sometimes the session can drag on far longer than that. But even before the session actually starts, the work begins in what we call them committee weeks. Basically, in the months leading up to the start of the session, lawmakers will periodically travel to Tallahassee to hold a series of committee hearings that are designed to sort of prepare for the session. So they start working on some of the bills that have been filed for that session. They start moving them along, getting them into position where they can pass them once session begins. And so I think we have just wrapped up what I think was the third committee week ahead of the 2026 session, but it was, to my mind, the first committee week that really mattered because we started to see some really big bills, some, in my opinion, really dangerous bills start to move. So these will be some of the biggest battles of the 2026 session began this week. And so I thought it'd be worth recording a quick podcast to sort of recap what happened this week and dive into those two bills specifically. One of the bills would, and as I'll explain, this is not an exaggeration, would pave the way for essentially a complete and total ban on all abortion in Florida from the moment of conception. It doesn't matter if the woman was raped or the victim of incest. It would pave the way for a total abortion ban. We'll explain more in just a sec. And the other is a bill designed to protect one of the biggest industrial companies in the world, the Mosaic company, which strip mines phosphate rock in west central Florida. It's kind of like the Tampa Bay region in south, and then turns that rock into fertilizer ingredients at these chemical factories in kind of like the Tampa and Lakeland areas of the state. Mosaic is a fascinating company for many reasons. It is one of the biggest and baddest companies in all of Florida politics. It is also indisputably indispensable to the nation's food supply chain because of the fertilizer products it makes that get used in industrial agriculture. But it also just destroys the environment in the places it operates. It like wreaks utter havoc on the land. It strip mines. It creates this toxic byproducts at its chemical manufacturing plants. And this bill that started to move this week, a bill that was, by the way, written by lobbyists for Mosaic. We have the records that show that. This bill would essentially protect Mosaic from some of the responsibility for that environmental destruction it wreaks. We'll dive a little bit more deeply into what exactly I mean by that in just a sec. Both of these bills, for longtime listeners of the show might recognize, these were both big battles during the last legislative session. Neither one of these passed, so we are resuming these battles from last year's session, or the last session. They are now will be again big fights during the 2026 session. So Once more unto the breach, my friends, once more. Before we get any further, let me just quickly remind folks, please click the like and subscribe buttons. If you can, leave a show rating or review. These are the kinds of things that help us grow the show, get this stuff in front of more eyeballs, get more people, help more people find our content. Also, if you have not already, please think about signing up for a subscription to the newsletter itself. The easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. That'll redirect you to our Substack link. Subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts are ever behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. And, listen, if you value the work we're doing, if you value our efforts to try and help folks understand just how important state and local government are to their lives, the impact it has on them, directly on them and on the issues they care about, if you value what we're doing and you got the means, please think about doing one of those voluntary paid subscriptions. The money we get from those subscriptions not only helps cover reporting expenses like the cost of pursuing public records from state and local agencies across the state, it also helps ensure that this content can stay free for everyone, even for folks who cannot afford to pay for paywalls and that sort of thing. So, okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about what just went down in the legislature's latest committee week ahead of the 2026 session. And so I think I want to start today with Senate Bill 164. And this is a bill, I actually think this is at least the third year we've been talking about this in Florida, but this is a bill that would essentially grant the same kind of legal rights to a newly fertilized egg, a zygote, an embryo, a fetus, as it already has, as a living child has. And so the way it would do that, specifically what this bill would do, is it would create a civil liability, a cause of action based on the quote unquote wrongful death of an unborn child. And what that means is that in a situation where a pregnancy is lost in an accident, so it could be, maybe there's some sort of medical mistake made, or there's an accident, a car accident, or some kind of other accident where there's some party potentially at fault, and a pregnancy is lost. It would enable a parent to sue on behalf of that, for damages on behalf of that lost pregnancy, of that the again zygote, embryo, fetus, depending on the stage of development here. And this is just within the context of just within the contours of the idea itself. This is a pretty extreme idea. So when you think through practically what this means, is what you're enabling someone to do is to sue for things like the lost wages of an egg that was fertilized last night. That a court is somehow expected to forecast what this fetus would have earned had it been born and grown into adulthood and pursued some sort of career. I think it technically, in cases, it gets turned around in the sense of what the parent has lost in future support. So it's practically the same thing. You're trying to forecast what kind of money this embryo, if it advanced to, it had been born, advanced to adulthood, provided in nursing home support or that sort of thing. It's just the way you even go about calculating that is just an insane proposition to begin with. But what makes this bill so dangerous is that it is part of a right-wing legal movement that is often called the fetal personhood movement. And what that is it is an effort to establish within law, to essentially build the legal architecture that leads to the conclusion that there is, from a legal perspective, fundamentally no difference between an embryo and a 17-year-old, right? That they have the exact same legal rights. And as you can probably guess, there are a lot of, if you get to that point, if you get to the point where the law views a living child the exact same as a fetus, or I'm sorry, a better way to say that is it views a fetus the exact same as a living child, the follow-on effects from that are pretty obvious. And the most obvious one is abortion. This is fetal personhood laws are at their core an attempt to ban all abortion. This is if you are going to take if the law views an embryo the exact same as a 6-year-old, abortion is functionally impossible. You cannot legally allow abortion in that situation. And again, like I said earlier, it doesn't matter the surrounding circumstances. You're talking about it doesn't matter if the egg was fertilized last night. Doesn't matter if the woman was a victim of rape or incest. It does not matter if you can establish fetal personhood in the law. If you can get that concept accepted by the courts, you have functionally banned all abortion. And for what it's worth, this bill is sponsored in the Senate by a Republican senator by the name of Aaron Grahl, who is the sponsor of Florida's abortion ban law, right? Like this is 100% like the sequence of events. Florida started by banning abortion at 15 weeks. Then it banned abortion after 6 weeks. Now we're going for fetal personhood so we can get a total abortion ban. But the thing about this too is it doesn't just stop there. So I mentioned this has been around a couple of years. Folks might remember that there was an enormous controversy in, I believe, 2024 in Alabama, where a judge used a fetal personhood law to hold basically an in vitro clinic that provided in vitro fertilization, to hold them liable for damages because there are embryos that get destroyed they get lost in the in vitro process. It briefly led to in vitro fertilization clinics procedures shutting down in Alabama. This caused like sort of national uproar. And so that actually killed the Florida bill that year. So the bill had been moving through the legislature, stopped dead right there. And now supporters of the legislation within the legislature are trying to get around this by the bill in Florida that they're now considering tries to kind of put a collar around this by saying that like an unborn child is an embryo at any stage of development um, in the womb, right? So like they're trying to like sort of cordon off only a fetus in the womb and not any sort of not an embryo in the womb, not an embryo in a test tube or something for in vitro fertilization. The challenge with that is it will not work, right? Because again, just logically flowing from this, if you are making the law say that an embryo is the same as a living child, then what does it matter where that embryo is, right? Like one way to think of it is, nobody would argue that like, a 35-year-old adult who was conceived through in vitro fertilization somehow has less legal rights than a 35-year-old adult conceived the old-fashioned way, for lack of a more scientific term, right? Just by the same way, like the legislature can say all it wants that this only applies to an embryo in the womb, but all it's going to take is one judge to look at that and say like, no, that's unconstitutional. You can't discriminate against, if this is a child, then you can't discriminate against another child just because that child is not in a womb, right? It is inevitable that will get struck down, and you start to screw with all sorts of in vitro fertilization, all sorts of reproductive assistive technology type stuff, pregnancy treatments. And by the way, this is what a lot of activists want. Like, I mean, we have watched now, this is the second year in a row where we've watched this bill come up, and we've seen sort of the most extreme anti-abortion people come up there and get upset that this does not apply to embryos outside the womb. The pressure, just like we talked about, the way this has evolved from first they ban abortion at 15 weeks, then they ban abortion at 6 weeks. Now they're going to do fetal personhood so they can ban abortion completely. The next step will be then banning in vitro fertilization, and this starts to affect all sorts of birth control techniques that are designed to stop pregnancies in the first place. Like this is a Pandora's box that once you open cannot be closed. And that, by the way, a lot of the people involved in this are smart enough to know they're opening a Pandora's box. They want to open it. They just know that they can't say that. And so you end up with these bills that try and create these sort of like false safe harbor languages, like this idea that somehow we're gonna contain this only to embryos in a womb. This is extreme. This is as extreme as it gets. Now, I say all this. Senate Bill 164 passed its first committee last week. This was the Senate Judiciary Committee, but it only passed by a 5-4 vote. There were actually 2 Republicans that voted against it. Again, this is, like I said, I'm not lying. This is an extreme idea. So I believe the no votes came from Senator Tom Leek, a Republican from kind of the Daytona Beach area, and Senator Kathleen Passidomo, former Senate president, a Republican from the Naples area. So now what that would suggest, if you got a controversial bill that is just barely eking through at its very first committee vote in a committee week, we're not even into session, this bill is probably in trouble this session. I would suggest if it's the sort of thing you care about one way or the other, you folks should be hearing from you right now because this is the sort of thing that it's teetering. It's teetering after a 5-4 vote. But the other thing to watch out here is in Florida, we've got this really, really sort of well established pattern now where once things get too extreme, even for the Florida legislature, then, the courts or the DeSantis administration come along and find some other way to get it done. So, one thing to watch out for as this debate plays out is that, if fetal personhood fails legislatively, that we don't just see some extremist judge turn around and just declare it and read it into the state constitution that fetus is a person under the Constitution. So, this is clearly now into at least year 3 of this debate in Florida. Clearly, it is not going away. But this is when people talk about just how far right the Florida legislature has gone. This is the sort of thing that they're talking about. The fact that they're working on this bill for the 3rd year in a row, and that it is at least important enough to someone that it's getting a hearing 2 months before session begins. They're getting a head start on it. Maybe they don't have the votes this year, but something tells me we're not that this fight is not over. And so that brings me to the other bill I wanted to talk about today, and this is House Bill 167. And sort of like we do with all our daily recaps during session, I'll throw links to the actual bills into the show notes and a couple of stories about them too, so you can read more if you want. But this is the bill written by the Mosaic Company, and this deals with former phosphate mining lands and sort of radioactive contamination on those lands. And so just to try and quickly explain what's going on here is, so the way the phosphate industry works, and when we say the phosphate industry, we're really just talking about Mosaic. Now, it used to be a lot of phosphate mining companies in Florida. Now it's all basically consolidated down into it's just Mosaic, which is, again, as I said earlier, one of the biggest corporations on the planet. In phosphate mining, you essentially you strip mine the land. It's basically like there's a bunch of phosphate ore, particularly again down in what they call it Bone Valley, and this is kind of the area just south of the Tampa Bay region. You excavate it from the land. It's usually buried 20 to 50 feet below ground, and so you got to scrape all this rock, this phosphate ore out of the ground. And this phosphate ore is mildly radioactive. It's got and when you scrape it out of the ground under law, the mining companies have to they call it, they have to reclaim this land. You can't just leave behind these giant moonscape canyons and stuff. You essentially have to fill all the dirt back in. They scrape off the top. They then scrape out the phosphate rock, remove that. Then they take all the fill that they've pulled out and they put it all back in. And they call it reclaiming the land. It's really more kind of like a rough facsimile of the land. I once did a long story for Florida Trend where I got lots of access to folks at Mosaic to understand their process and stuff. It was fascinating. Reclaiming is really sort of like a misnomer, though. This Mosaic executives would tell you that this land is, they're very proud of the ways they put it back, but that it is not the same land that was left behind. But anyway, as I mentioned, this phosphate ore is mildly radioactive, and when you refill in the land, you end up leaving behind some of that radioactivity, that radioactive material, and it is now closer to the surface. He was initially buried below, like I said earlier, between 20 to 50 feet of essentially, they call it overburden, I believe, but essentially soil and growth and plants and trees and animals and stuff. You've now left this radioactive material much closer to the land. So the radioactivity levels on the surface of land that has been mined and reclaimed is higher. Now, there are debates like Mosaic and the phosphate industry will tell you it's still within safe levels. There are actually debates about this. So there is a lawsuit going right now that brought on behalf of people living in a couple of mobile home parks that have been built on top of former Mosaic mine land that have sued, alleging health impacts from the radioactive levels on the land they're living on now. I am not going to pretend to be some sort of radioactive expert or scientist on this sort of stuff. What I can tell you is that case there's enough merit to it that Mosaic tried to have it dismissed, and the court has allowed it to proceed forward. The court has looked at this and decided there's at least enough merit to these claims to try them. And so this case has been dragging on a few years now. They're still just in the class certification process. Enter House Bill 167. Again, we saw a bill like this filed last year, too. This would essentially make it much harder to sue Mosaic or a former phosphate miner over radioactive elements, radioactive contamination left behind on former phosphate mining land. And it would do it in a couple of ways. One of the most significant things is one of the biggest sort of like the most powerful laws we have in Florida. I believe it's called the Water Quality Assurance Act, but it is essentially a law that says if a company leaves behind pollution, it's been a while since I've read about this, so I'm just like generally saying this, but if a company causes pollution, it is responsible for the impacts of that pollution. If it pollutes the groundwater, if it pollutes the lakes, it is responsible for that pollution, whether or not it was negligent in the release of the pollution. If it's responsible for the pollution, it's liable for the impacts from it. And so this law, this is one of the laws that is being these mobile homeowners are citing that are using to sue Mosaic now. So this law would essentially, House Bill 167 would essentially stop people from using the Water Quality Assurance Act to sue over contamination, radioactive contamination on former phosphate mining lanes. The second thing it would do is you can still sue under negligence, right? So what makes the Water Quality Assurance Act so powerful is you just have to prove the pollution exists and that it came from this polluter. You don't have to also prove that the polluter was negligent in allowing the pollution to happen. You could still, even if you don't have that, you could sue under like negligent, but you have to prove that the polluter did something wrong to release the pollution or something like that. This House Bill 167 would even throw hurdles to negligence lawsuits, and it would do so specifically. The key issue here is it would require anyone wanting to sue to get these radioactivity tests done in advance to test the land, and they have to file the results of these tests with their initial complaint. The challenge here, this is a bit of a loophole, is that there's nothing in this bill that requires a landowner to allow someone on to their property to do these radioactivity tests if they're going to sue. And if you're Mosaic, why on earth would you allow someone who's going to sue you onto your property so they can get the test they need in order to sue you, right? This strikes me as a potentially major loophole in this bill that nobody is talking about, and nobody talked about yesterday in the House Judiciary Committee where this bill passed. Wait for it, 21-0. So kudos to both parties being the same, man. This is one of those bills where like it blows my mind that everybody can somehow think that this is a good idea and sort of not even raise objections. Now, we have seen there have been legislators last year that have pushed back on this. So hopefully we'll see better debate and scrutiny around this sort of stuff as this moves a little further. This bill, though, it is on the fast track. So we will be writing more about this legislation soon. But like, among other things, this bill is a top priority of the president of the Florida Senate, a guy by the name of Ben Albritton, who represents his district, includes a big chunk of what we would call Bone Valley. He's defended Mosaic in other avenues in the past. The House, the only reason, honestly, this did not pass last year, I think, is because the House and Senate got so crosswise with each other. The House sort of was holding it up as a negotiating chip. The House seems to have put it on the fast track this year. It is assigned. It's one of the most powerful lawmakers in the chamber, a guy by the name of Lawrence McClure, a Republican from kind of near Tampa Bay. He's carrying it. He is the appropriations chairman in the House, which is like one of the most powerful positions, basically a key House leader. They've given it to him to carry, which is a sign that the House is planning to pass this year. So this bill seems like it's on a fast track. So we need, hopefully there will at least be some substantive debate and people can get some answers to these questions about how exactly this would work in practicality. If someone has to get onto Mosaic's property to test something before they can even file a suit to begin with, how is that supposed to work? And I do want to flag one other thing. The only kind of substantive question that anybody asked in this House Judiciary Committee hearing yesterday on this bill was whether or not this legislation would impact this pending litigation. And because again, there's like I mentioned, there are these mobile homeowners that are alleging like significant impacts from the radioactivity, elevated radioactive levels in this land that they've been living on. And the answer that came back was no, this won't affect it. Except there's nothing in the bill that makes it clear that it won't affect this. And the reason I bring this up is we've been down this path before. So a couple of years ago, Florida Power and Light, which along with Mosaic is one of the handful of most influential companies in all of state politics, was hit with a class action suit over claims, I believe it was Hurricane Wilma, and it was essentially allegations that the company failed to adequately prepare and protect its infrastructure from the hurricane. And as this case was moving on, and this case had gotten even further along, if memory serves, I think it had even gotten the class certification, gotten further along than even this Mosaic case. The Florida legislature came along and passed a bill that said basically you can't sue. Or it didn't say you can't sue. It like moved jurisdiction of these kind of cases from the courts to the Public Service Commission, which is like one of the most like industry captured agencies we have in all of Florida government. Moving a dispute to the PSC is essentially the same as just resolving it for FPL's behalf, right? And in that, as that legislation was moving through, there were all these questions about, will this affect this pending case? And I remember the sponsor of it said, no, it's not going to protect that. It's not going to affect the pending litigation. And then there was debate like, well, can we say that in the bill? It's like, we don't need to say it. And they refused to actually put in the bill that it would not affect pending legislation. They refused to make that explicit. And sure as shit, as soon as it passed, FPL used that bill to get that case thrown out. It used this new law to undo the case that had been filed even before the law changed. Basically got the rules changed and then retroactively used those rules to undercut the suit. I guarantee you that is what Mosaic will do in this case unless the legislature steps up and puts in there specifically that it makes it 100% explicit that it is not retroactive, that it does not affect any pending litigation. And anybody who just like takes their word, takes supporters of this legislation's word that it's not going to be radioactive, that's willful, that's willful ignorance as far as I'm concerned. We've seen enough out of the Florida legislature. We've seen enough how these bills work. We've seen this story enough times to know that that is not how it is going to actually play out. So anyway, I'll throw a link into the show notes with a longer story we wrote about this legislation from last year. It's got a lot more context. This is, by the way, the last thing I'll say about this is this has got enormous ramifications because Mosaic is one of the largest landowners in Florida. It owns something like, going off memory here, but something like 400,000 acres of land. It's one of the top 10 landowners. Like something like 200,000 or 150,000 of that is already like reclaimed mine land that you're essentially imposing all sorts of like liability restrictions on all that land. Now, this is an enormous piece of legislation that is being treated like it's just a tiny little tweak to our laws just to protect good actors. It's well, like I said, here's hoping we get slightly better debates and like more credible questioning out of people to make sure we like actually scrutinize this before Ron DeSantis either signs it or sticks it in his back pocket and allows it to become law without his signature. So, okay, we're gonna leave it there. I'm gonna do another podcast soon. There's a story we posted on Seeking Rents recently. I'll throw a link to it in the show notes, like underscoring getting into a really shady land deal that the Florida legislature and the governor recently passed. I feel like I've already been talking longer than I intended to here, so we'll do another podcast soon, sort of exploring that story more in depth. But I'm gonna throw a link to it in the show notes, so you can read that if you want. And then as just a quick reminder, like you read that, you sort of like the journalism you're seeing there. Remember that there are these voluntary paid subscriptions. Easiest way to find us, seekingrentsfl.com. Okay, we'll leave it there, and we will be back again soon. Take care. Bye.